Welcome to the ClassicalU Podcast. ClassicalU is a training platform with over 100 self-paced online courses and new content added regularly. We customize and brand learning pathways, serving schools as well as offering individual subscriptions to parents, teachers, and school leaders. Visit ClassicalU.com to learn more. I'm the director, Jesse Hake. On this show, I interview our course presenters as well as authors and leaders in classical education, talking about running a great classroom, teaching the human and fine arts, the great books. We're delighted to have you listening. Thank you for joining us. I'm very excited to be speaking today with Dr. Shannon Valenzuela, and she is a professor of literature at University of Dallas and the program that they have for classical educators and other departments at the university. She's also recorded a new course with us on ClassicalU on medieval literature, the Harmonics of Storytelling. And I'm just so glad that you're spending a little time with us to talk about your course and your work. You work in such a range of areas. I could go on and on. I know you're also involved with the Ambrose Center there at the University of Dallas. But thanks for chatting with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to talk about all the things with the course and everything else. So thank you for having me.
Very good. Yeah, it'll be hard to keep our conversation, contained and focused, but that's okay. Hopefully there'll be a harmony, at any rate. So, with your title, which I hope I got correct, you've got a concept that you talk about in some of the introductory lectures of the mathematics of story, and you're talking about the Quadrivium, as music and astronomy and math. The number as important actually to the meaning of story. Some of that language, I feel like, at least in the contemporary world, can kind of suggest, and you work against this right away, in your lectures. But I think you're smart to do that, and so I'm kind of doing it as well, in the podcast question here. But I don't think harmony does this as much, but like a term like the mathematics of story can kind of take the life out of story, and I wonder how you would respond to analyzing something in a way using the Quadrivium and the quadrivial arts without actually killing the living, the living nature. And experiencing it in terms of, like, let's say, poetic knowledge, These things aren't really antithetical. They actually complement each other, which I think you demonstrate and talk about, both in your course. But how would you share that with an audience that's kind of thinking about this course and looking at the title?
Yeah, so this is such a great question. And maybe I'll answer it by kind of coming to how I arrived at this particular approach and why I feel like it's important, and then sort of maybe in that story of how this came to be, I can address that question of why doesn't kind of looking at what I call like story math, why doesn't that, as you say, kind of like take the living thing that is a story and dissect it and kill it on the table, so to speak. So as you mentioned, I do teach the Quadrivium course here at the University of Dallas for our classical education program. It's one of the 5 required courses for the concentration in classical education. And the Quadrivium, of course, being 4 out of the 7 liberal arts. So when we talk about the Quadrivium, we're talking about arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And people tend to think, okay, these are the arts of mathematics, right? If the arts of language are the trivium, the grammar, logic, and rhetoric, then these are the mathematical arts. And, when I get students in the class, in the program, 95% of them are teaching in the humanities. Most of them have not seen a math class in many, many years. And most of them are terrified that it's a math class and that, this is therefore going to be a real problem in the course of their graduate studies. I myself am not a math person in sort of the technical training sense, right? I am a medievalist. I have my background, my PhD's in literature. I happen to teach math and science for K-12 schools as part of my work as an educator, but I am not trained as a mathematician. And so it wasn't until I inherited this Quadrivium course at the University of Dallas that I had this opportunity to come to the arts of mathematics from this liberal arts perspective. And it really opened up a tremendous vista for me. And one of the challenges that I found myself presented with, being a literature person by training myself and working with all of these humanities people who were coming into the class and not really sure, they would tell me things like, I'm not a math person, I don't do this, I'm not, and running up against as well the fragmentation of our curriculum where the humanities tends to be separated on one side and the math STEM subjects tend to be separated on the other side. And you're either one or the other, right? You very quickly the two roads diverge in the yellow wood and they don't come back. So you just have to pick one and that's the end of the story. And so I found myself kind of confronting this challenge. How do I work with and show teachers that the grounding in the liberal arts is not meant to be subject area specific? The liberal arts are meant to inform all subjects. They are meant to be part of our formation intellectually, and to help us to come to those things which we study with fresh eyes, right? And to give us skills and a way of seeing the world that is rich and that is deep, and it allows us to really tackle high level questions, look for themes. All of these different aspects, right? And so it's not meant to be subject specific. So with that kind of in mind, I started thinking, well, how would, a humanities person start thinking about math? Like, why is it important for someone who's going to be teaching literature to have a grounding in the Quadrivium? What gifts does this area of study give to that teacher? And I started noticing the medievals are beautiful in this way because they had this very integrated worldview. They did not have something that had been pulled apart and segmented. And, Dante, we see this in Dante, which is the fourth series here in the course that I put together. It culminates in Dante for a reason, because I think he just demonstrates so beautifully that you can bring all of these liberal arts to bear on something that's cosmic and beautiful. And so it seemed like a very natural place to go. In my exploration, I'd already started thinking about Dante. We do Boethius in the Quadrivium class. That's the text that we actually end with in that Quadrivium course, is the Consolation of Philosophy, which is where I begin this particular course, again, for a reason, because I think Boethius captures that idea. And rather than say, okay, we're going to do an arithmetic of story, we're going to do a geometry of story, we're going to do, music is easier. But, we're not going to do an astronomy, what does that even look like to do an astronomy of story? What I arrived at was these sort of fundamental principles that the Quadrivium allows us to see. It's a training in seeing. And it awakens us to certain kinds of principles that, it basically underlie our reality, I think, and the ways that we think about things, the way that we communicate. It's the four principles that I really love to talk about. It's order, proportion, pattern, and harmony. And so those are the four things. So rather than thinking about it as there's some sort of an equation that we're working with, we're thinking about how do these stories, the way in which they are structured and the way in which they, in their very structure, help us to see reflected the ordering of the cosmos. This, especially in medieval literature, they saw a sacramental nature to reality. They saw that it was an ordered cosmos. They understood that we are participating in that. And so it becomes a very beautiful place to go to see these things in action, to see these things working. And although I kind of divided out into these four principles in the course, course one on order, course two on proportion, and then pattern, and then harmony, they're all in operation all together, right? So once you kind of make your way through and you start to notice, we kind of put the lens on each one individually. My hope is that you will start to see, oh, but I can go back now and I could look at the Consolation of Philosophy and I can see all four of these working. I could go to Dante, I see all four of these working, right? And it's not just meant to be contained in medieval literature itself, but you could move out from there. You can move beyond the medieval period and look at other things. And it's not meant to be necessarily only constrained to literature. I think you can take these principles and also start to look at the story of history through this lens, perhaps. It's a way of helping us to begin to see these principles in action. And it, like I said, it is a way of seeing. And that was sort of the thing that I arrived at through the process of teaching the Quadrivium course, and then trying to figure out how to make that really speak to those teachers who are not going to be teaching math, but how would this enrich their teaching, right? How would this enrich their approach?
Yeah, I think the pointing out the exemplar, particularly of Dante, starts to open the door, for a lot of people, because that's so richly visual, ordered, structured. But the seeing ties it to experience. So I think like poetic knowledge, and a kind of, I think, unhelpfully simplified idea of poetic knowledge, maybe, when it feels antithetical to some of this. Another way of putting it is experiential knowledge, but if you're advocating that this is a way of seeing, you're actually inviting people in, right, to spatial relationships to like explore through these four ways of seeing that ultimately you're saying are integrated, and another popular, I think, word that gets associated with medieval literature in classical education circles, at least, is enchantment. The idea of the cosmos being alive, and I would imagine, as you said, harmony is maybe the easiest one, but in each of these ways, you're actually seeing life, right? You're seeing. Dante's famous for saying it's love that moves the stars, but this isn't. This is actually a way of seeing that life, that love, the desire that's moving things, etc. Is that?
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right, and I love that word, enchantment. And it does. It opens up. It kind of goes back to your first question about how does this not end up being a sort of deadly approach, we might say, rather a life-giving or an enchanting approach to literature. And I think it's enchanting in the same way that we might say, if I were to walk out my front door at night, let's say I am somewhere where I can see the stars. I'm here in Dallas, so we see a few, but not and certainly not as many as I would like. But if I'm somewhere where I can go outside and I can look up into the night sky, and I can see the cosmic array, right? This wondrous tapestry of stars and galaxies, and I am sort of humbled before that. But I see that there is an order to these things, right? I can see that these planets and the stars are moving in a way where they're it gives me a sense that there is something so much larger than myself. That there is, but there is something. And I think that this is what the medievals would say, right? There's something governing all of that. There's some sort of a law of the cosmos that's holding all of this in balance, and that's making the stars. And they have the idea, of course, that there was a music of the planets, right? That there was a cosmic music because these things were in harmony. The orbits of the planets were in harmony. The stars moved in harmony. And so you have that beautiful idea. And that is an enchanting idea. And it is something that we see very readily in the natural world. We could go outside and we can say, okay, well, I see that there is an order to things. I see that an ecosystem has a proportionality to it. I see that there's a harmony here, and we could look at architecture and say, oh, I see the proportions of this building. I see how all of these things are working together. If you go in any of the great cathedrals, for example, I mean, it's visual music in so many ways, right? Because you can see the proportion, you can see the harmony of the parts to the whole. And so it's essentially taking that same framework and saying that the same thing works in a story. The same exact thing that we're looking at visually, this sort of, in stone and glass in a cathedral, we can also see in a literary text. And so it's very much a similar way of seeing. And I think it is enchanting. I love structure. I love looking at the ordering of things. I love, when you can feel the music of a story, You feel the music of a sentence that works well. There is a certain beauty to that, right? There's a certain enchantment to that that just helps the writer communicate what they want to communicate about the world. It's just, it's a treat.
I think the architectural metaphor is really helpful too. So, music, I mean, everybody knows that counting beats in poetry isn't killing poetry. I mean, that,
Right.
it's the beats that literally, hit, resonate with your chest and create that sense of movement and life. In the engagement with Boethius, where you start in this course, you reference Lady Philosophy's claim that love is the law that orders all things, and that I think all of us tend to have these handicaps. Maybe medieval literature professors, are past some of these handicaps, but everyday life, I feel like, kind of keeps retraining us in the wrong way, right? But we would put a distinction again between order and love. Like, love is about freedom and being able to accomplish good things for the people I care about, and its order is like an impediment to that. Or we have so much of that, but that phrase, Lady Philosophy's claim that love is the law that orders all things, does that connect in not only to this kind of overarching point that we've been talking about, but is to other as a theme, in other places in the course?
Yes, definitely. I mean, that is almost exactly what Dante arrives at, of course, at the end of Paradiso. It's the love that turns the sun and other stars, right? And he himself is part of that motion. He's drawing that directly out of Boethius. I mean, this is the great conversation happening there between these two philosopher poets, we might say. And yes, I love your distinction as well about freedom and love and law, right? So in the course on pattern, we look at how pattern is involved in this, right? How does play open things up? How do we look at what sorts of laws have we inherited, perhaps, and what is the kind of freedom, I suppose, to move within that? What sort of things open up? What's the invention here? What's the playfulness here? My favorite, Chaucer, is masterful at parody and play. So we look at two of the tales, actually three of the tales in that particular course. The Chester play of Noah's flood. Anytime we're talking about inheriting a tradition and then some sort of invention is happening, there's some sort of a playfulness there of, can we marry this with another trope? Can we take this idea and make it come alive in a new way for this particular audience, something that they would understand and is relevant, but also opens up the original text in a way that maybe we're not expecting. So that kind of playfulness, it's sort of, in a sense, it's kind of like a playground where there's a fence around the playground. If you kind of think of like the different, playground equipment that's on a playground. It's not like, kids are let out to recess and it's like, okay, kids, run wherever you wish to run, right? There's sort of a boundary around that. And there is certain things that you're kind of given. And then, but the kids have a tremendous amount of freedom within that to kind of explore and do their own thing and invent their own games and whatnot, right? We can imagine.
Right. Yeah.
The other thing, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, please finish.
Well, I was just going to say the other place where I kind of play with that idea, this idea of freedom, is sort of the transgressive, right? So in the second course, we talk a little bit about proportion being part of this ordered equation, right? And that things that are disordered are generally things that are out of proportion. So we talk about the monstrous, for example. So we're kind of going on the other side of this. So there's a kind of narrative play that is joyful, that's inventive, and then there are those things that take us out of harmony, out of proportion. Hildegard of Bingen would say, for example, sin breaks the harmony between the soul and God, right? So it puts us into a disharmony. It puts us into discord. The monstrous tends to be those things which are out of balance, which are somehow in a violation of a law of nature or a law of the divine. And so we can kind of look at it from both of those sides, right? So But I think that, yeah, that idea that love as a law, and how does that make us more free? How does it not just restrict you is one of the big questions. And I think that a lot of the medieval authors that I look at in the course are taking up that question in one form or another. This is, of course, the question in Dante's Divine Comedy with respect to sin and punishment and justice and law and love, right? That all of those questions are kind of wrapped into one in Dante for sure. And then in many of the others that I look at as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dante illustrates how disorder is a kind of enslavement, right? And you end up, enslaved or trapped by your passions. One of my podcasts recently was with the philosopher D.C. Schindler, who would, overlap a great deal with your own thinking. And we, not surprisingly, given that's one of his, great areas of professional work, we're talking about this as well a little. Yeah, it's a major theme that I think coming out of medieval literature has so much to say to the modern world, and to the United States of America in particular, where we rightly value freedom and talk a lot about freedom and tyranny and these things. But there's this whole kind of other way of understanding freedom from our passions and freedom within the capacities that order provides to us. But let me just read that. I love the titles actually of your 4 courses, okay. And you were referencing 2, 3, and 2. So the first course is Foundations of Order in the Medieval Imagination, and then the second little mini course is Love, Justice, and Transgression in the Middle Ages, and then the one that you were just referencing, course number 3, Polyphony and Play in the Middle Ages, and then 4 is Beauty and Transcendence in Medieval Storytelling. And the Polyphony and Play, it almost sounds like something only modern authors do. But you're pointing out that medieval authors did this too. They would use the structures and the orders as something to bounce off of and interact with. And of course, that's what music is, right? It's playing with these incredibly remarkable orders and structures. But they're doing that with story in very intentional ways. So I love that. Both sound like, kind of like, postmodern or something. But, does the circle come all the way around?
Yeah. Yeah, that if I had to pick a favorite of the 4, and it's very hard to pick. It's like asking someone to pick a favorite flower in a garden. I have a very hard time, but I do love the idea of the playfulness of all of this. And I do think there is a sense in which modes of invention tend to stay around. So some of this is coming out of the understanding of like, how do you invent something new? And Chaucer will express this as, you plow under the old fields to grow new corn. So you're working with something and you're going to transform it in some way, and you're going to use that to grow something new. So it's not like you've just completely relocated somewhere else, but you're rather working within an established sort of plot, if we will. And you're going to raise up something new. And so one of the things that sort of different modes of invention, the sort of medieval and classical arts of invention would talk about receiving an inherited text, and you can look for the gaps. Where are the gaps in the text? Where did they not tell the whole story? Or where did we maybe cut away to a new, perspective and we left a gap in the story? And one of the suggestions is you can step in and you can retell the story, but fill that gap. That's a great way to invent. And this is, by the way, these are great techniques for classical educators to use in the classroom if you're trying to get your students to engage with a text. So a little bonus tip. I use these all the time. I tell teachers, use these ideas because it really does help students to start to put their own ideas into motion with respect to the text they're engaged with. So you can insert something part of the story. So one great example of this that I talk about in that 3rd course is the Chester play of Noah's Flood. So Noah's Flood, we know the story from the scriptures. And the piece that's like inserted into this is is the argument between Noah and his wife. The wife does not want to get on board the ark. She wants to stay with her friends. She's sad that her friends, it seems, are going to be lost in the flood. She doesn't want to get on the ship. And so she and Noah have this little domestic dispute as he's trying to get her on the ark. The sons are trying to get her on the ark, and she's, saying, but I want to stay with my friends. That is one of those brilliant examples of taking a story that everybody would have been familiar with, but inserting this comic moment that would have been, again, playing on tropes that the medieval audience would have been very familiar with, and creating this delightfully comedic little moment in the course of this particular play. And so yeah, it's one of those instances of sort of expanding a story. And then, you can also cut a story down, or you can take tropes and invent on them. So Chaucer does this, of course, brilliantly well in the Tale of Sir Thopas, just playing on what's the received tradition about romance storytelling, where you have a knight who goes off in a quest in the forest, and it's just, he's going to create something that is so empty of substance that it's funny, but it's also annoying, and it just creates this delightful dynamic within the Canterbury company about this terrible storyteller, Chaucer's own character in the Canterbury Tales, telling the two worst stories in the entirety of the Canterbury Tales. It's a literary joke of first water, right? It's just brilliant. So delightful. It's just fun, right? Once you start to see that, right? It really opens up a side that this is one of those misconceptions I think sometimes people can have about the Middle Ages, is that it all seems very, it can seem like it was very rigid and regimented, and there's a sort of a certain idea that we have about the Middle Ages if you're not sort of immersed in the period. And one of the things I think people forget is how playful they were around things that we would say, wait, you shouldn't play around with that. That's not funny. Noah's Flood's not funny. Like, how are you making this a comedy? And yet, right, they had no problem kind of bringing in these elements. Second Shepherd's Play is another one that's just brilliant in this respect, right? Talking about the shepherds who are going to come see the Christ child. I don't talk about that in the course, but there's so many examples, right? I had to make hard choices as to what I was going to talk about. But that's another one. If people are interested in seeing that playfulness, Second Shepherd's Play is great.
That's great. So what are some of the things you did cover that might not be on a typical, so most of our audience, of course, are K-12 educators. And I know you do a lot of teacher training, in that realm. And across quite a few areas, I've heard you give a presentation on science instruction, and you say you teach some science yourself in a K-12 setting. So you cross over that line between, the university and secondary, but the on a typical, let's say, high school or rhetoric school reading list, what are some of the things you cover that might not show up, and then some of the things you cover that are likely to be on someone's kind of required list?
Yeah, no, that is a great question. So I do bring in a number, especially like the Anglo-Saxon poetry tends not to be on a typical reading list. If we're looking at medieval literature, we might be doing something with Chaucer. We might be doing Dante, right? Dante tends to be, especially junior, senior year in some of the classical schools, we're seeing Dante's Divine Comedy come in. And maybe we get a little Boethius. It kind of really depends on the school. Sometimes we might see some Chaucer, especially the General Prologue. If you're going to read some Chaucer, General Prologue and the Knight's Tale, if Chaucer's showing up, those tend to be the two that are read. So I do cover those. But one of the things that I wanted to do, Beowulf also tends to be in, not necessarily in high school, that I've seen on the 8th grade middle school reading list oftentimes. So Beowulf will appear there. But I did draw on some of the Anglo-Saxon poems. And some of the, the lyric poems, kind of giving us a sense of that part of medieval history. So, of course, I mean, the Middle Ages, 1,000-year span of literary history is massive, right? And so there's so much that happens that it's nice sometimes to give a sense for the evolution of the period, I suppose we might say, right? So beginning kind of at the beginning, Cædmon's hymn as the first recorded, in a sense, poem in English, right, in Anglo-Saxon. the story of that, and what does that mean, and then looking at the Anglo-Saxon heroic poems. If you want to know Beowulf, if you want to understand Beowulf, right, having a sense of what's going on in the Battle of Malden, as this great heroic poem, can be really helpful. What's the code that's happening here? What's the code of honor? The Old English poem Judith is a tremendous poem, and presents that heroism, again, that taking a scriptural story, inherited scriptural story, but marrying it with this Anglo-Saxon understanding of what does it mean to be a good king? What does it mean to fight for one's lord? What does it mean to be a shield maiden? What does it mean to be, kind of a noble, someone who fights nobly? What kinds of motivations are going on there? It's a fascinating poem for so many reasons. So those are some of the things that I really wanted to give a sense of. Similarly, with some of the other tales from Chaucer, to give a sense of his range, and the kinds of themes that he's talking about. We don't, as I said, we don't often encounter much of the Canterbury Tales, but I think for teachers, it maybe can be helpful to kind of get that. And again, I could only do a fraction, right? I had to pick very carefully, but there's so much to do there, and so it kind of gives you a little bit of a taste or a flavor of what kinds of things was Chaucer interested in? How were the tales in conversation with one another on some of these questions? It's a very rich work in that way. And then, of course, the kind of the deeper, as deep as I could do in sort of the framework that I designed, right? An exploration of Dante from this perspective of narrative harmony, right? And kind of playing with music as a structural element in the comedy, but also kind of the bringing together of all of these different themes. So it's meant to give teachers, even if they're not going to be directly teaching these works, I think it's truly meant to give you a sense for the period that maybe goes beyond sort of what we might call the quote unquote canon, text. If you're not going to be a medieval scholar, like what are the few things that you might encounter to get a sense for the period? I wanted to kind of expand a little bit beyond that, giving a sense of Christine's City of Ladies, again, sort of a unique perspective, questions that are going to be echoed in Chaucer's Wife of Bath's Tale. So I put those kind of in conversation. Some of the Arthurian romances, Chrétien de Troyes and the Knight of the Cart. So trying to give a little bit of as much as I could, right, almost like a 360 view of the period, and just give teachers a bit more of an experience of what this literature is like and the dynamic range of these texts in the period. It's really fun. It's a fun place to to hang out for a while from a literary perspective.
Yeah, I think, would it be fair to say this is great, that kind of 360 experience that you're giving of the Middle Ages? I think a history, theology, literature teacher, there's quite a range. Even if you're not, teaching one of these particular texts, I think this is a great way. We have a course by Junius Johnson, who's on the Middle Ages. Classical Academic Press has a Humanitas, in our high school Humanitas series, a collection of readings from the Middle Ages. But regardless of maybe what subject area you're kind of coming at it from in a K-12 setting, I think this is a phenomenal deep dive and kind of experiencing that whole world, imaginary world, and the visual structure, tropes. You have a lot. You cover a lot of material. The Dream of the Rood is one you didn't just mention. That's one where I think you get particularly theological and kind of connect to faith. What are some places where you think maybe theology or Bible teacher might particularly connect with some of the content you cover?
Wow. I mean, that's such a great question. Yes, some of the texts much more explicitly than others, right? You mentioned Dream of the Rood. Dream of the Rood is an extraordinary poem. I don't know that there is another like it in the canon of and I know all poetry, but I have not run across another poem that is presenting that particular event from this perspective, which is telling the story of the crucifixion of Christ from the perspective of the cross. Is a completely unique point of view. deeply reflective. It brings in, again, all these kinds of questions which would have been so familiar to an Anglo-Saxon audience about what does it mean to be loyal to your Lord? What does it mean to serve? And the idea that the cross itself is a noble thane of the Lord, right? That he is a servant of the Lord and is doing the Lord's bidding. It's just an extraordinary poem. But there are so many, as I mentioned at the beginning, right? The whole period was saturated in a worldview that believed that there was a sacramental nature to reality, right? That everything is sort of a reflection of the Creator, that law of love is visible everywhere to a greater or lesser extent, right? So you almost can't get away from it, in a sense. And I think that, there are a lot of critics of literary critics who will we're not going to try to have that aspect of the period influence our reading of a certain text. I don't know that you can pull it apart in that way very easily or comfortably, without betraying something of the nature of the worldview itself. But I think that the Consolation of Philosophy is one that theology teachers would draw particular richness from, even though it's not told from a particularly theological standpoint. Lady Philosophy is helping Boethius to understand suffering and helping him to understand how do you make sense of evil in a world that is governed by a God who is good. He's asking such relevant questions to students today are going to have those questions, especially students in high school, right? Yeah. As soon as they have a little life experience in their, of the world, they're going to start asking questions of how do we make sense of this? How do we understand this? It's such a profound question. And so I think that taking a look at that particular text and how Lady Philosophy works with Boethius and kind of starts him off by saying, well, that the stars are ordered. Like he starts with astronomy. That you look up at the stars and you say, there has to be a God who governs all of these things. Okay, well, once we start from there, we can start to build. And so just kind of watching how she leads him through this very real experience of suffering and exile and all of these things to arrive at, again, a place that is hopeful and, has a trust and a faith in a God who is good, even though it seems like there are things falling apart. So that's definitely a text I would recommend. Of course, Dante would also recommend the poem Judith, I think, as well, just because, again, it is a scriptural text. So seeing what the medieval author is doing with that story, what kinds of themes are drawn out by almost in a sense having the Anglo-Saxon overlay, right? This sort of shield maiden warrior overlay on top of the scriptural text, what sort of emerges from that can be really interesting. So those are a few places I would really recommend for teachers who are doing theology specifically.
Thank you. You referenced earlier, a particular methodology or, set of ways of engaging a text that, I think it was Chaucer was using in order to do creative work, to tell his stories. But you're saying the same techniques also help students to engage any text or maybe even any topic. What are some of the kind of, hidden helps to teachers that show up in these structures, that they might be able to apply even in other subject areas or to help them, design their student learning experiences or assignments and things like that?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. One of the things I would say is, in a sense, I'm modeling how you might take a particular thematic through line and assemble a group of texts around it. So around the question of order, for example, or around the question of the monstrous and the transgressive, like what, if you want to look at how you're setting your curriculum up, what are the big questions that you want to tackle in the readings? And maybe you're handed a set of readings and sort of it becomes your job to either put them in a specific order or even if you're just designing questions that are going to help students to start making connections between the texts in your curriculum. So for example, I taught 10th grade humane letters, for example, and it was a world literature class, and so we were reading things as diverse as Pride and Prejudice and Crime and Punishment, A Tale of Two Cities. I mean, we had a beautifully rich curriculum around these different novels from different historical periods. But one of the things that I would encourage teachers to do is to look beyond sort of a chronological ordering of things and start to look more at theme. Start to look more at the big questions that you want to tackle. What really interests you about these particular texts? And they're all sort of colliding in your curriculum, right? What's going to emerge from that mixture that's exciting and that's new, or that raises questions that are maybe challenging to tackle, maybe challenging for you to tackle? Not to ruffle any feathers, but in a certain sense, chronology is almost the most boring way to organize things. Sometimes it's a necessary way to organize things, and it can be helpful. I did try to follow a chronological pattern in this course myself, right? But looking beyond just sort of the this and then this and then this, sort of ordering of events, to why does it matter that these texts are the ones that we're looking at, right? Why have you chosen this particular set of texts? You mentioned Junius Johnson earlier, and one of my favorite things, we had a conversation on the ClassicalU podcast for the University of Dallas, and one of my favorite things that he said in the course of that interview was that no text has earned the right to be on your syllabus. There is an intentional choice. There is an intentional selection process now. Sometimes you're handed, as I said, what you are to teach. But I think then it becomes up to the teacher, and you can get inventive and creative in the ways that you're looking at the types of characters that you're studying across. Are you looking at, there's so many questions, there's so many different angles, right? So I would say from a sort of meta pedagogical standpoint, you could kind of look at the way that I've organized this course as here's how you can marry both a chronological ordering along with a thematic structure. So I'm putting these particular texts in conversation because they're all reflecting a certain thing that I want us to take particular look at, right? So that's something that I would really encourage teachers to do as you're designing your questions for discussion for your students. It helps you and them, I think, to start forming those connections between what they're reading. But then the other beautiful thing I would say is reach outside of your discipline. So that's one of the beautiful gifts, of course, of being a medievalist, and why I wanted to be one, to be honest, is because I love literature, and I was a literature major and a classics major at UD as an undergrad. But I wanted to specialize without specializing. I kind of wanted to cheat a little bit. And the medieval period, because again, it is so integrated, allows you to, and you almost have to delve into different subject areas, right? You have to you have to know a little math, and you got to do a little bit of, some theology and philosophy and different things, just because the period itself is so rich and the writers are drawing from these traditions. And so that's the other thing I would say, is that be aware of what other people are teaching around your students, right? What are they doing in math class? You might think that's not relevant, but hopefully this course shows you that, in fact, what they're doing in geometry might well be relevant. What are they studying in history if you're not also the history teacher, as in a humane letters situation? What are they doing in science? What are they doing in any of their other subject areas? And how can you encourage them to pull from those other courses, those other experiences, to enrich their reading? So I think that's another gift of the medieval period in particular, is kind of learning the power of that level of integration with the other subjects. They all are participating in this conversation. Going back to the earlier question about how the math of storytelling isn't, sort of some monstrous thing in and of itself, right? It is meant to kind of show that, right? That there is a level of integration here that is really powerful, I think. So I encourage teachers to explore that for themselves.
Thank you. The topic of the transgressive and the monstrous is a challenging one to take up with students. I think there's so many things about middle or high school students. I think Beowulf, as you said, is often taught in middle school, and that certainly brings up the monstrous rather fully and directly. There's so much pressure in the kind of contemporary culture to really valorize the monstrous and the transgressive, right? And I think I would say for myself, there's a little bit of a Christian reason behind that. I'm not justifying it, but just the humanizing of, us in our monstrousness, reached and touched by Christ on the cross. There is, and so I wonder if in medieval literature, as you're talking about a topic like that, what are some bridges that you could give to teachers between, I think the medieval mindset just has so much more of a fully Christian understanding. They don't have this kind of angst that we I would say largely post-Christian society have around this. So like teachers are going to bring this even themselves, right? Like a teacher teaching Beowulf might have only read John Gardner's novel Grendel, and so they're going to be strongly inclined to bring in this kind of postmodern or whatever we might name it, tendency to valorize the transgressive or the monstrous in some way, shape, or form. But are there bridge building? How would you respond to that? Are there examples within the medieval literature itself that kind of could give a purchase, in a Christian way to some of maybe the positive tendencies behind that? But then how do you also just, say, well, that's not what we're doing. We're actually calling a spade, and sin, which is also Christian, of course.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the ways in which this sort of idea of beginning with a sense of what does it mean for something to be well ordered? What does that actually mean? And not just sort of from a religious sense of okay, well, here are the commandments and I'm sort of following the commandments. But this extends also to what does order look like in human relationships? What does order look like from a political standpoint? I was mentioning earlier, what does it mean to be a good lord to your people? This is a question, for example, that Tolkien, as a medievalist, is, with the Lord of the Rings, there's a reason why it's the Lord of the Rings, because a ring giver is meant to have that kind of responsibility to those he governs. It's a gift-giving culture. That's how you reward loyalty. So there are, starting from that perspective of understanding what does it mean to be well-ordered, when you then start to look at where are those instances where you see people crossing lines, where are poets pointing us to things that are out of balance or out of proportion. So Beowulf is a great example. Beowulf, a literal monster, but he is marked as one of the race of Cain. So there's a sort of genealogy of monsters in Beowulf, which is really fascinating. And there's a sense that there is an ordered society, and then there is the kind of chaos of the darkness and the shadows and the moors, right? The kind of what exists outside of the boundaries of human society. So it's not just a religious thing; it's also a society, a social thing. It's how is this political structure working? What does he not like about what's going on in the Hall of Heorot? He doesn't like joy. He's certainly not a fan of any kind of joyful anything. But then some of the other questions that we can take up are questions around injustice, any kind of injustice. So some of the writers that I look at in that particular course around transgression are looking at, well, what does it mean for you to tell someone else's story? Christine de Pizan in The City of Ladies is taking on the sort of Book of Wicked Wives legend, right? That sort of paints women in this line of Eve, right? Where it's like, okay, well, if it weren't for the sin of woman, then we wouldn't be, sort of. And she presents an alternative narrative of like, well, look at Mary and look at the saints and look at, the noble ladies. And she kind of has this alternative version of what does that look like? The Eve and Mary kind of debate, I suppose you might say, but like, what does it look like if women were to write the story of what this looks like? How would it be different? And Chaucer also takes up that story, and Wife of Bath's Tale is very much in that same vein of what does it mean for women to kind of take up this story. So there, in a sense, there's kind of all different ways that we can think about this idea of transgressive, and then like, what does it mean to have sort of like the anti-hero or the villain who's glorified, some of which I think comes from the literary poetic tradition of Milton and the handling of Satan in Paradise Lost, as kind of like this epic heroic figure, which sort of quite literally like spawned a whole sort of like, set of stories where we start to blur the line between what does it look like to be evil, monstrous, how do we understand that? How do we understand transgressive action? And what frame do we put around that? So I suppose I would say it's helpful to begin from sort of an understanding of order, because you have then something to work with, and you can start to, it becomes illuminative, I think, of where boundaries are being crossed, where borders are being crossed, or where injustices are starting to happen if you start from that understanding.
Yeah, there's something good to be protected. And the transgression isn't just a random kind of rule that's being broken. It's actually for the sake of life, flourishing, goodness, beauty. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just so easy to be, Grendel hates joy, but also there is this, even I think in the text, a little bit of, it's easy to be sympathetic when he's so lonely, out in the darkness, listening to the music. I mean, his response is, ghastly, terrifying, in all. But there is a kind of loneliness and alienation that's so easy to relate to. Do you think I think the examples of the women and the line of women is a great one. That kind of a response from something that's being put on the outside that really it isn't Christian to put on the outside, to exclude women from the camp, or from the city, isn't Christian. So I think it's great when we can kind of point to examples like that and say, the medievals as Christians were recentering certain things, because of order, for the sake of order, actually, a higher order. And it just happens to be, I don't know when this, probably in January, when we release this, so it'll be very late in the 12 days of Christmas, or but the time of year when you begin talking about Eve and Mary and the kind of relationship there. It's a good time of year to be reflecting on some of that. If there was, kind of one insight, I think a lot of your insights are, I would say, first for teachers, and all very applicable for teachers. Most all of them would be very much, for high school students as well. But if you were thinking in terms of what are, top one or two insights that you would say, don't hold on to this one, make sure your students get it too, to teachers, what would you kind of pull out of the rich assortment you've got here?
That's a great question too. I think going back to the point about integration, I think that once students start to realize that what they're learning in their different classes, it's meant to be in a conversation, and it's welcomed that those things are in conversation, that offers them a kind of freedom, I think, that can really enrich their experience. And particularly, I would say, one of the things that if you want to encourage students in this way, students who maybe in your English classes or humanities classes who say, I'm not, I'm a math person. I'm not a poetry person. I'm not a literature person. One of the things that sort of the approach that I've kind of taken with this particular course, I would love to encourage teachers to look for how does this start to help math and poetry play together in a way that could welcome those students who have, in a sense, written off the humanities, right? Because they feel more comfortable dealing with numbers and with geometry, with the sort of, in a sense, almost like the certainties that come with math and the kind of fuzziness that comes with literature can be a little bit challenging sometimes. And it goes both ways, right? I would say, how might this open doors for the study of poetry or the study of literature to students who may have written that off because they feel like they're not good at it, they feel like they don't have anything to offer to it, and rather saying, no, if you have a deep understanding of geometry, you have a profound understanding of what it means to be proportional, you have a profound understanding of what it means for a part to relate to a whole. We have to have that in literature. Like, you can't have a story that functions if the part and the whole are out of proportion. This is Aristotle in the Poetics. He says that there has to be a magnitude in plot. There is proportionality in plot. And the beginning and the middle and the end have to be carefully chosen and designed. It's in order. There is a magnitude of theme that is proportional to the structure that you've chosen. He uses all that kind of mathematical language to describe what it means to have a well-ordered story, to have a well-structured story. Yeah. And so those students who have a deep mathematical sense of what that looks like actually can be very gifted at perceiving how a story works on that kind of level. So that's maybe the one thing. I don't know, I feel very passionately about that, just because in again, like going back to my own experience teaching the Quadrivium, seeing it the other way around, and sometimes also, teaching literature classes and having math and science students come in and say, I really don't feel like this is not my area. Like, I don't feel comfortable dealing with literary text. I don't know what to do with this, right? But when we're able to kind of highlight the ways in which each of these contributes to the other, and your way of seeing that you have developed so carefully over here is going to give you profound insight over here, even though you may not expect it. I think that's a gift. I think that's a gift that teachers can give to their students. And so in whatever way you can encourage them in that, I definitely, recommend you do. And maybe it'll help to offset that pull apart that I was mentioning earlier, where it's like we have the humanities over here and the humanities, they humanize the sciences. Literature's gift is taking these big kinds of questions about the ethics of things and what does it mean for us to make certain decisions? What kind of consequences come with choices? Very necessary, over, especially in the sciences. When you were talking about the isolation of Grendel and sort of the loneliness of the monstrous, I was thinking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, for example, in the way in which she deals with that very question. Who is the real monster here and why? Yeah. And how does that isolation and loneliness and what does it mean to be in community? There's so many questions there that are so rich. Also tied to these questions around science and the emergent science at the time, life and death, and what are the boundaries around this kind of thing. So yeah, that's get the subject areas to talk to one another. Encourage your students to bring their gifts and to really help their fellow students to see these things, because they do have a lot to offer.
Yeah, that's beautiful. We are such a fragmented and kind of siloed off world in so many ways in our lives, and anything that can work against that and invite people back into an integrated experience of reality and our lives through medieval literature. If medieval literature can't do it, we're really lost, right? So,
yeah, right. I would agree with that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I love how you said, it's almost like it takes a Renaissance person to study the Middle Ages. I feel like there's a kind of counterintuitive, like, we think the Renaissance was leaving the Middle Ages behind, but maybe, it really takes a Renaissance person to study the Middle Ages, because they were so inherently integral across all these disciplines. Yeah. Well, What are some, so, I've mentioned a few ways in which your course relates to other material, one on ClassicalU, and I wanted to kind of turn that question back around on you. But before I do, one other connection that just came to mind in several things you said was we have a course on women in the tradition, and several things you've been referencing, overlap and would dovetail beautifully with some of the content in that course. You've mentioned, the Quadrivium as a required part of the master's degree program where you teach. What are some other connection points between some of this material and the master's program?
That's that's a wonderful question. I mean, definitely with the Trivium course as well because of the grammar, logic, rhetoric component. But yeah, this course really designed to kind of show those touch points between the quadrivial arts and the arts of poetry, the arts of literature. Some of the other things, we do have a Christian epic course that we offer that, we do Dante in that particular course. So that's a very rich kind of an overlay. We do have essentially it's like a Great Worlds course. And there is one on the Middle Ages, so it kind of tracks historical periods. There's a modern world, there's a medieval world, classical world. There is a kind of great works focus to that course. So this, in a sense, kind of overlaps a little bit, although again has a little bit of a different focus than some of those other classes. Yeah, those are the ones that sort of immediately come to mind as far as points of connection or something that would resonate, with this particular course within our own program. Yeah. If
you love this course, also check out.
Yeah, that's right. So. Exactly. If you love this, then also take. Yeah. The also bots is great.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Was there any question I should have asked or that, that you were wishing I had asked as we wrap up, that you could save the day for me with?
No, I mean, this has really been lovely. We've gotten to talk about like the different courses within this series, which I think is just lovely. And I don't know that there's a question that I wish that you had asked that I didn't get a chance to speak to. So no, thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance to range over all of these different things.
I'll happily end with being flattered. So, thank you so much, Shannon. You're bringing your expertise, to a course that is even a little outside of the lineup that you guys offer, where you teach. It's just really exciting, and I do think this is a wealth of untapped material that is, in a sense, intimidating and hard to access, with our students and for ourselves. And you've given us a whole bunch of different ways in. So thanks so much. It was wonderful, wonderful chatting.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And thank you for letting me, in a sense, pilot this approach with this particular course. I really appreciate the opportunity to do that. So Thank you.
Well, I hope there's much more to come. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the ClassicalU Podcast. Thank you for tuning in and for following us with our courses, training teachers, parents, school leaders on ClassicalU.com. Our training platform is owned and operated by Classical Academic Press. As listeners, you can purchase any book from Classical Academic Press outside of our digital items, as well as any ClassicalU subscription at our special listener discount of 10% off. Just enter the code CU Podcast, all one word, at the point of purchase to receive this discount on any book or ClassicalU.com subscription. Finally, please also watch for live learning webinars in collaboration with Scholia Academy, which offers live online courses for primary and secondary students. Thank you for listening.